Next, it's my pleasure to introduce our facilitator for this evening's conversation, Dr. Monica Heller of the University of Toronto, who will introduce our distinguished speaker. Monica's work focuses on the role of language in the construction of social difference and social inequality in the post-nationalist globalizing new economy, with an emphasis on Francophone Canada and Western Europe. Monica is a two-time recipient of the President's Award from the American Anthropological Association, a former president of AAA, and chairs a task force seeking the next editor for our flagship journal, American Anthropologist. Professor Heller will introduce our speaker.
Merci, Alec. Bonjour tout le monde. Bonsoir, plutôt. Je suis Monica Heller. I'm a small, not so young, female-ish anthropologist wearing a black dress, which seems to be the uniform for tonight. I'm not wearing a shawl, and that's the first rule that we're going to break. I think this evening we're going to break maybe a few more. I would like to introduce our keynote speaker, Douglas Cardinal, who is a tall, slim, distinguished gentleman who is wearing a gray jacket and a very nice tie. So it's my honor and my pleasure to introduce to you Douglas Cardinal. We have with us arguably Canada's best-known architect. Born in Calgary, educated at a residential school, he's been deeply influenced by his Blackfoot and Métis heritage. Strong ties to the Canadian West, as well as to the Ottawa region, where he currently lives and works. His name is associated with iconic buildings, and you'll see some of them on the screens, some of the buildings and plans and drawings that have been involved in them. The ones that he probably is best known among us for are the Canadian Museum of History in Gatineau and the National Museum of the American Indian in Washington, D.C. But he's been involved in a very, very wide range of projects, ranging from private homes to spiritual centers to industrial buildings, schools, and clinics. I won't list the innumerable awards he's received for des temps, et pour qu'on se concentre sur l'essentiel du message, but he is wearing some of the evidence of some of the most important awards that he has been given over the years. Mr. Cardinal calls his approach organic architecture. I think your aim, as I understand it, is to link inside and out, to connect us to the land and to each other. You've pioneered the use of computers in the design process, linking technology to nature and spirit, and involved in educational initiatives, which we'll talk more about later, linking the work of Waldorf education to Indigenous knowledges. So as we've seen, the theme of this meeting is changing climates, changer d'air. And one could argue that both anthropology and architecture are in the business of imagining alternative worlds, better worlds. Indeed, while it's often said that beautiful buildings are breathtaking, one could say that yours are breath-giving. So we're seeing a lot of these buildings, but what we're going to do now, for the purposes of this conversation, is we're going to focus on three that you've chosen from different points in your career that will allow us to better understand your philosophy, your vision for building a hopeful life, and in particular a hopeful path for Indigenous communities. So I am going to make sure that we now switch the slideshow to the first building that we're going to talk about, and here it is. So this is St. Mary's Church in Red Deer, Alberta, your first major commission in 1964, completed in 1968. So having been obliged to attend a Catholic residential school in this same community, I'm going to ask you to talk a bit about what it meant for you to undertake this project. And while you're telling us, I'm going to flip through some of the slides that we have so everybody can appreciate the shape of the building. And then we'll talk also about the technological aspects and the symbolism of the space, and in particular of the altar. So tell us a bit about what it meant to you to do this building.
This building was very important to me because it was something I felt I should give back to the church. Father Merckx, who was a priest educated in Rome, he was from Germany, Father Werner Merckx, wanted to design this church around the new liturgy with the support of Archbishop Jordan. And they wanted something that was totally, would change the approach to of the church that came out of Vatican II. And so he wanted to start from scratch and said, let's go back to the early church and let's just see how we can design something that reflects the past, the present, and the future. I want you to design a Catholic church without a crucifix or a cross on it. I wanted you to show in a sculptural form, I'm a Catholic church. And we would go on a spiritual journey together to make it happen. So the Archbishop totally supported this. So we, every day at 4 o'clock, he'd come to see my sketches, and then we'd play Bach organ selections just to get in the spirit and feeling of the church. He was a musician. And when I went to the residential school, it was very tough for me to be away from my loving parents, and because they were very much in love with each other and they loved ourselves, my brothers and sisters, so much that we were filled with loving and caring. So to be away from my parents was extremely difficult, and I had a very heavy heart most of the time. So to fill my heart, I decided I would embrace the music and art and architecture of the church. And so I was surrounded by the arts and music because the church was such a great patron of the arts. So that's how I dealt with my own suffering and in a sense. But I saw the wonderful works of architecture by the amazing architects like Michelangelo and Raphael and Bernini and Borromini and all these great architects. And I felt that was something that I would love to do, is create beautiful buildings for people and follow my mother wanted me to be the architect. My father brought me up as a hunter and gatherer. We lived in a log cabin in the bush, in the forest, and we lived totally off the land. We had no water, no sewer, no electricity. We drew the water from the lake, and we cut the wood for the wood stove, and we lived totally off the land. And my father taught me to hunt and trap, but we had to be at one with nature in order to survive and thrive, because I felt rich with all that abundance of food and everything was there, and we just had to honor and appreciate all of our life givers that were there. And so it was a special relationship.
We agreed in advance that I could be what will appear to be horribly rude, but to ask you to, every now and then, speak to some of the particular images. So you were just talking about nature.
Yeah.
And here you've provided some images from nature that link to the technology and the design of this church. Could you talk a little bit about, I think also the roof was another element where this was a moment where you began to use technology to bring together nature and architecture. Could you talk a little bit about that?
Yes, I had to have and study all the elements of the church and then see how they would relate to each other and how they would function together. And at first, I wasn't thinking of space, I was just thinking of of how the new liturgy would work and function. And then my job was to wrap the building around that. And the building was called St. Mary's, so I wanted it to be to be ionic. It should be a female form and should be nurturing female form. And so I wanted the brick to wrap around it in a very sculptural way, feeling the power of the earth and the rhythms of the earth. And so I had to go back and see how the Romans did that, and they used brick as a form and poured concrete in it, and it allowed any shape that they could create. And because we had a very limited budget, we couldn't build a building out of wood and fill it full of concrete and tear the wood building down and face it with brick. I used a brick as a form for the concrete. And as I laid the 2 wides of brick with concrete, air-entrained, lightweight aggregate concrete, I was able to form the walls very, very economically because I had a very tight budget and $350,000 to build a church. And so in doing that, I had the challenge of, okay, that's a very simple form, but Father Merck said, my last church burned down because it was made of wood, and I want you to make this building out of concrete so I wouldn't have that problem. So I thought, how am I going to build a huge concrete roof? I mean, I would have to form it. I couldn't, it would blow the budget. So I was trying to figure out how to design the roof, and then I thought, well, the best way, I can see an infinite variety of solutions in nature, structural, mechanical, electrical solutions. Nature has done all of these amazing solutions all around me. So my elders said, if you want to learn from nature, you have to be get off your ego and sit down and be at par with a blade of grass and watch and look at everything around you and see. You're looking for a solution. It's there. It's in nature. So you could see.
So how did technology get involved?
Well, I had this problem, and while I was sitting there, I saw a spider build a web, and I thought that's the way I could build my roof of the church. I could use a web of steel cables, and then use that also as a form, because it had to be a certain shape, because I wanted it to a spiral form, and it had to be acoustical shape that would that could have a long reverberation time, like a shell that you put up to your ear. You can hear the sound reverberating in the shell. So I needed this shape so that when Father Marx would say Dominus Vobiscum, it would be Dominus Vobiscum. It'd have the feeling of a cathedral.
So is this when you started using computers?
Yeah, so I had to have this shaped roof, and so I had a team of engineers, and they wanted a solution for the roof in mathematical solution. Architects like Gaudi made models when he did the solutions, a model analysis of developing all the stresses and strains for the roofs. But they wanted an analytical decision. So my engineers worked it all out of how to develop engineering the roof form, and it took 81,000 simultaneous equations that had to close. So the mathematicians say that's impossible. It would take 7 men 100 years just to work out the mathematics. So I think that something I learned from my own people was that if you declare something very powerfully, the universe shifts a bit, because by declaring it, you create the possibility it can occur. And so, but you have to state it. This is which, and then the right people will show up. So we looked everywhere for the right people, and we found a computer in Chicago that was actually a building of all tubes. They didn't have transistors at the time.
So this is 1965.
Yeah. And so we had punch cards and whatever, and in a few days we were able to solve the mathematics of the roof, so we were able then to pull it together.
So maybe we'll, before we move on to the museum, could you say maybe just one or two words about the altar, which is another important part?
Well, we had to have that shape. So what we did was we have the walls on the outside, and we poured a big ring girder, and in the center we put a light cannon that we strung all the cables to it like a bicycle wheel, strung all the cables to it, and then we put insulation under and mesh under the cables so that we could pour concrete on the roof and embed all the cables in 3 inches of concrete. And because they were plastic coated cables, we could post-tension them all. And like you see these figures, these dolls where you tighten strings and they stand upright. Well, it's the same thing. We came in and we post-tensioned all the cables inside that light cannon and lifted 250 tons in space. And that became the roof.
The roof. And the altar, you have it in a round shape?
Well, the altar, yes. We spent a lot of time designing the altar. I was sketching the altar, and that's the reason for this space. That was the symbol of Christ according to the new liturgy. The altar is the symbol. And so it was the source of Christ and the source of divine light. And so I wanted to have all the light come down over the altar so that all the light in the whole space would come from the altar, because it's the source of divine light. Well, we'll then make it the source of all the light that comes into the building over the altar, and that shows the strength of the altar.
Right.
And we went to that detail. Father Merck said, I designed the stone and had polished stone initially on my sketches, and he said to me, Christ was not a man who wore linen. He wasn't a finished man. He was a rough man. He wore linen. And I want you to leave the saw marks on the stone. So that's the kind of detail that we went into. Everything had to be done with a spiritual act. Everything that you saw in the church had to have meaning and history to it. And so it was a real opportunity for me to be able to bring that vision into reality. When we came up with the sketches of it and the layouts of the sketches and the ideas of it, Archbishop Jordan said, I approve this design, I approve the budget, and unlike I will finance the church on one condition. I approve it all finance, that you put 12 consecration stones inside, so I could come in and consecrate it as a cathedral when it is finished, which he did.
So let's move forward 20 years to the next building, which is the Canadian Museum of History in Gatineau. So museums for our group of anthropologists that you have here are complicated. They're complicated in a museum like this, which is supposed to be about a national narrative, in a place which has got a double settler colonial history and the specific conditions of the 1980s when you were working on this building. And for us, museums are fraught spaces where we try to engage with some of the thorny problems of anthropology's role in colonialism and decolonization. Could you talk a little bit about some of the issues that you faced with this building and how you tried to solve them, both inside and out?
Well, again, you need a patron of the arts. You need somebody that has the power and money to be able to create buildings. And my patron was Pierre Elliott Trudeau. And how we met was he put out the white paper, which would wipe out all of our indigenous rights and our cultures completely. And the elders in Alberta asked me if they would bring their vision into reality, which means their future, and that I would be able to make a presentation at that time for primarily Indian control of Indian education, because we should educate our children with their duties that we saw that we had to deal with in the future. And so in order to do that, I was asked to present their vision to the Prime Minister, and which I put together. And really, their vision primarily was one of loving and caring and teaching the immigrant culture how to love the land as we love the land, how to teach them to care for the mountain streams and the wind that blows across our brows, and teach them to love and care for all life as we love and care for all life. And that's why we need to be here. We need to carry our teachings, no matter what difficulties and hardship we've faced. According to our prophecies, we have to retain our connection with the land and with each other, and treat each other with loving and caring and respect for all life, including our own, and to be able to fulfill the prophecy that we have of teaching the immigrant culture to love as we love.
So does the Ottawa River play a role in how you understand your vision for this building?
Well, in the presentation, I got, although I fought his policies for 10 years, he was able to be convinced that we should remain here, that we shouldn't be wiped out by the bureaucracy of Canada. And then he felt that the museum should be an expression of that, of the people's culture, and so that it would be a voice of the land. Because he said we're all come to this country because we love and appreciate the land. So rather than be a symbol of the British architecture or French style of architecture, it should have another expression. It should come from the architecture of the land. And so I was asked to enter the competition of all the architects across Canada, and then they recommended me to do the project to him, and he then commissioned me the project. So then he had this vision that this should be a place where all people could come together and meet, and that we would be all respect each other's culture, and all the cultures of Canada would be able to be welcome in the museum, and that would be expression of the land. And so
more recently you've been involved in the redesign of the History Hall, is that right?
Yes, because at the time, Canadian history, according to the scholars and the universities, and definitely the government, and definitely the bureaucracy, that Canadian history would start when the white people came to the Americas. The settlers started Canadian history. And however, the museum, new president, last year we finished it and it was open to the public, that we have the Canadian history start from the last ice age, like over 10,000 years ago, which includes our history, showing that we were vibrant cultures with laws and governance and viable communities thriving communities living in peace with each other and respecting each other, and we wanted to show that, and then and how our lives have changed since the settlers have come, and we show in there all the agreements that we have made, and every one of them being broken. So we showed the true history of Canada. He had scholars go right across Canada, including Indigenous scholars. And we rewrote Canadian history, the good, the bad, and the ugly, all together, and put a true history of Canada in the museum.
And you've also been involved in an exhibit, Unceded Voices of the Land. This is my plug for this exhibit, Non Cédé, Terre en Récit. Very nice bag. That is currently in the museum. Could you talk a little bit about that?
There was a group of Indigenous architects that got together and wanted to represent Canada's architectural Venice Biennale. And they wanted me to be the presenter. So I was asked to pull it all together and create this exhibit representing Canada in Venice. Venice is such an amazing city. Love it, absolutely. And it's going through really troubled times because of how we're treating the Earth, how we're treating the planet. I just noticed a few days ago floods on the water. So it was amazing to do an exhibit in Venice, and so immediately I went back to our Anishinaabe grandmothers and asked them for guidance, because we always ask for guidance from the women because we're a matriarchal culture, matrifocal culture. And so I listened to the grandmothers, and they said, you've got to do it in a good way. People are not going to learn by having somebody hammer them over their heads. They can only learn by respect and loving and caring. So you've got to present our worldview in a proper way. And so I listened to the grandmothers and everything that we presented.
And could you tell us about this image?
Well, this is showing really that it was the women that chose the leaders, and they chose the people that should wear the authority of the headdress, and they were the ones that put the headdress on their leaders, but also if they did not listen to the women, they took the headdress off. So they were in charge. And in this patriarchal culture today, many chiefs and council make agreements with the government of Canada, which is they're not the rightful spokespeople for those decisions. It's the women that should be making these decisions. So that's a very important part of our culture, because we're taught that the soft power of love is much greater than the hard power of force. And so you don't make your decisions by force. You make your decisions out of loving and caring and respecting people. So that's the basis of our culture. And that's what we showed in our exhibit in Venice. And we wanted to show that the people, no matter what we've gone through in the last few hundred years, that all that has done, all the suffering and hardship we've gone through, all it has done is make us stronger. And our elders say there is no bad, there's just good, and a crooked good that needs to be straightened out. Because what we learned from the crooked good of this experience we went through is what really matters. And it makes us stronger in our beliefs, stronger in our culture, and makes us more resilient. And we wanted to celebrate our resilience and our survival.
And so that message and that process of consultation leads us to our third building, which is the Gordon Oakes Rare Bear Student Center at the University of Saskatchewan in
Yes.
Saskatoon, which was opened in 2016.
Yes.
Right? So could you tell us a little bit about this building and about the processes you engaged in and your vision for it?
Well, I have always these great patrons that have amazing visions, and this was Peter McKinnon, who was the president of the university. And he wanted to build a heart and soul of the Indigenous people on the campus. He wanted to make the Indigenous culture very much part of the campus. And it's in a very prominent location when you come into the main, in the entry to the whole campus. This building is right there. And so it welcomes everybody who comes in, like our people today welcome people to come in peace and friendship. And so to do that building, I worked with the elders, the traditional elders, and we sat together and we had a vision session together. They told me what their vision was, and we asked the grandfathers and the Creator to come and help us with that vision. And we laid out the vision together with the elders so that they could have ceremonies into the building. There are certain protocols in the building, and that is, the strongest one is that if you have to connect with the four directions, east and south and west and north. You connect with the four directions and heaven and earth. You connect with the heaven to the cosmos and to the four directions. You connect with the source of all creation. And when you connect to the source of all creation, when you connect to the source, you become a sorcerer. You become a magical being, clothed in flesh. And so we wanted everyone to realize that that gift of creativity that we have makes us a magical being, that we have the power to create anything that we can imagine. And that's our power as human beings. And we should be really responsible for that power the Creator has given us. We have to act more responsible because we have been very irresponsible, my Creator, in what we've done to our Mother, the Earth. And we have to change that. So I wanted to follow the elders' wishes by following that protocol of being connected to the four directions, heaven and earth, so they could bring their ceremonies into the building and share them. Otherwise, they wouldn't be able to do that. And so that's the whole theme of the building. And it's so that the elders, before they had to do the ceremonies in their houses and whatever, they had no place to do the ceremonies. In this way, they can say, "We'll see you at this building, and we'll do these ceremonies there." And so it's not an Indigenous center per se. It's a student center because the Indigenous elders wanted to welcome all the students there. So it's a student center for everyone, because that's the teachings that we all want to be together. Some of the elders feel, unless all the races are in the lodge is not complete, because we need to connect with each other in a loving and caring and respectful way. So that's the whole theme of the building.
And so education has been a very strong thread, strong theme through many of these buildings. And so I think the last one we'll talk about is this one, which is the Freedom School in Akwesasne. So you've been very involved in education. You've set up a foundation for Waldorf education and Indigenous education. Could you talk a little bit about this school, about the education vision behind it, and how that fits the mission of your foundation?
Yeah, well, when I was educated in Texas, had a professor who was from Germany, and so he could translate all of Rudolf Steiner's work for me, and so I studied Rudolf Steiner's work, and he really thought like one of our elders in terms of how all life was sacred and magical, and that as an architect you can create spaces that truly serve people if you respected the environment, if you respected the people, and particularly with caring and love and respect for the children, and how you build spaces around the children and his method of teaching, which is all about loving and respect for the children. And here, the grandmothers here, of course, want to introduce Waldorf education because it is about loving and caring. It's not one about discipline and about a bunch of rules. It's not a bunch of square rooms with a whole bunch of chairs that kids have to be forced to sit in when they're all want to run and play, and it's designed around their way of being and respecting the children, and so the grandmothers adopted his method of education because it was about loving and caring for each child. And the grandmother said, we want to teach our Mohawk warriors, our young people, not just the women, but the men in particular, that we want to teach them to be loving and caring people. And it's not Mohawks against the world, it's Mohawks and the world. We want to teach them to be loving and caring, that gives them an opportunity to go anywhere in the world, and they'll be able to make a contribution because they're loving, caring people. And that's what we want to teach our people. So that was their whole, and they wanted to have a space that would have that. And everything is taught according to their teachings. It's all in their traditional teachings. And Mohawk is the language of education. In fact, when we were talking to English with each other, the children were sort of giggling because they hadn't heard English. And so they did that school, and they call it the Freedom School, because they will have the freedom to go anywhere in the world after that, because they can accept anyone of any different culture as equal, and so that would give them the mobility they needed to be citizens of the world.
So I think we'll close there. I want to thank you from the bottom of my heart for sharing these incredible, powerful images and these stories that are also powerful. I think we're all here this week looking for ways to imagine a better alternative world. And I think we'll all take away a huge amount of inspiration. Je vous remercie vraiment du fond de mon cœur. C'est une inspiration énorme et j'espère qu'on aura l'occasion de continuer à parler, à discuter et à se raconter des histoires. Monsieur le Président, would you be so kind as to come and close the opening?
Before I do that, can I ask you all to thank Douglas Cardinal one more time for sharing his vision with us? Thank you, Douglas, and thank you, Monica, for facilitating the conversation this evening. In the spirit of creating a harmonious environment and continuing our discussion of such environments, I'd like to invite you all to join us for an all-member reception with light refreshments and a cash bar. It's in the back of the room, so you need not go far. And again, welcome to the meetings, and take care of each other. Good evening.